So while I'm waiting for my paper to thoroughly dry, I start to look at my leaves and try to figure out my next steps in what I want to do. Okay, so I have my underlying yellow layer. So now I've added to my palette some other colors. I've added red, green, and blue. So these are, again, primary and secondary colors that I can use within my leaves. Now if I touch my paper and it feels cool, it's still wet. Remember, we had wet the back as well as the front, and so it was wet all the way through. That means even though I can touch it and it sort of feels dry, if I add color right now, it will still mix with the colors that are there. Okay, and right now for the first layer, I do want it to be completely dry. So in the meantime, let's kind of look at our big maple leaf here. And we're going to look in a little bit closer, and we're going to see that on top of that bright yellow, we have a couple of touches of green, and then we have this beautiful orange, and we have lots of deep reds. So now when we're going to drop our colors in, we're going to stay away from wetting the background. This time we're going to do each leaf individually. So we're not going to wet these two leaves when we're working on the maple leaf, okay? And vice versa. So if we're looking at our leaves, we're figuring out, okay, what's my next layer going to be? Well, I see lots of orange in there. With this kind of orangey color beside it, I want to go deeper. Look how much darker that is than that. So I know I've got lots of color I can add to get it as dark and as intense. That yellow and that orangey yellow are, you know, very, very different in darkness, okay? And look at this one. It's got a lot of the browns in it. So we're going to have to think about, okay, but it's almost leaning towards brown, but it still has the orange in it. So how do we come up with a brown that looks like that? Especially if we don't have one in our palette. So we're going to use complementary colors to create this brown. Okay, so I think we're going to start with our easiest one, which is this one here. And I'm going to put it right here for reference, so I have it close by. And then once my background is completely dry, I am just very simply with my clean little brush, I'm going to wet it following the lines that I drew, and I'm not going to wet the paper around it. Now, watch my hand. I'm working within the object. I'm not going like this. I'm not starting out here. That would wet the outer part. So I'm working within it. I'm using a flat brush which has an edge, and I'm pulling it along the edge just to outline it. If I drew it really soft like I was supposed to, it might actually even be difficult to see at this point. So now I can turn it to do the other side. I'm still working within the leaf, within the object, okay? Why is that important? Well, if I was working on the outside bit, I would be getting it wet on the areas that I want to keep dry. I want the areas to be like a fence or a border to my leaf. I don't want the colors to leak out of that area. So right now I'm just painting it in with water. That's it. But I'm being very careful when I get to the tip. I'm using the edge of my brush. I'm turning my paper to get the best angle. Okay? There we go. Now, as I don't mind that some of the yellow mixes with the colors I'm going to put in, I'm doing it maybe a little bit sooner than I normally would, but I'm going to make sure I don't touch this background. So now I'm going to pick up a little bit of the orange, and I'm looking here and I'm seeing that there's quite a bit on this side, so I'm not afraid to gently drop some color again within the leaf, and I'm just going to pull it gently like this towards the center, okay? Just a little. I am not putting it everywhere. I actually want to leave the tip yellow. I want to leave this side. I know I've got color in some of the other areas, and so in those areas I'm going to put the orange in and just pull it along. But not everywhere. Sometimes we think once we add a second color it has to go exactly where the first color went, and that's not the case. The other thing that I have this quite a dark brown line down the center, and so that means it's okay for me to take my brush and actually draw in that line just a little bit, and I use the tip of my very flat brush just to give an idea of where that line might be. And now I'm not going to go too much further than that. I'm going to take a tiny bit of red. When I say tiny, it's this little speck on the tip of my brush. I'm going to go back in while it's still wet where I started over here, and I'm just going to add a little bit of red along the tip, because if you look at the leaf, it actually has this edging, a little edging of red. And then I'm gently going to pull it in. I have not refilled my brush. I use the tiniest amount because I'm not looking to dump in a whole lot of color right now. And I'm going to just work my way along that same seam that I put in. And I'm just tapping my brush to get that line, okay? And I'm not going everywhere. I'm only putting it in a few areas. And same thing on this side. I'm actually going to angle my brush as if I'm doing the veins. Turning my painting. Get some of the red on the edge. And then I'm not going to mix it in. Okay? I'm not going to mix it in. I'm going to allow the paper to do that work for me, and it's going to turn out much nicer than if I sat there swishing it back and forth. Okay? So just leave it alone and let that layer dry. Okay? We're going to let these guys just dry up a little bit while we're talking, and then we're going to talk about how to make a brown in there. Okay, so we're just going to let them dry. We're going to turn our attention now to the maple leaf. Now this is a little bit trickier because our maple leaf is very close to this one, so we don't want our water to leak from one to the other. So I'm going to kind of avoid this area just a tiny bit, and I'm going to start wetting from up here. I'm again going to use the top flat part, the edge of my flat brush, to create the skinny tip at the top, and I'm going to pull it down. I'm working within my leaf. I'm using the side of my brush to just go along the edge. Pull it along. Now once you think you've filled it in, use the light reflecting off it to see if there's any spots you miss, because remember, if it hits a dry area, it'll stop the paint immediately like a fence. So make sure that everything is covered. Sometimes if we take too long, by the time we're finished down here, this area is already dried. So we want to re-wet, get into those little corners with the edge of our flat brush, like that. And then here I'm going to be especially careful not to touch the other leaf. Now, as long as I leave a sliver of dry between, I'm good. It's not going to go anywhere. But if there's even a little bit of wet there, it will carry it. Okay, so now that's nice and damp. I've wet it all again, and I'm going to look at my reference photo. Sorry, my reference leaf. I sometimes work from a photo. And I'm going to see I've got lots of yellow there. So I'm going to turn it the exact same way. So this is actually up here. Okay, I've got some yellow down here. So those are the areas I want to avoid. I'm going to pick up my orange first, and I'm going to work where it appears on my leaf. So I'm not afraid to put some down here because I've got this big, huge solid area. It goes all the way along this side. Again, I'm working within my leaf. And I can use the flat of the brush now. I can use the whole width of the brush and pull that along. Okay, and I'll bring it down to the stem like that. And I can do the same with the upper part here. I'm not afraid to add some, but as I come here, I'm going to be careful because that's got just mostly yellow. So I'm going to go over it like that. I'm going to go back up, use the skinny part of my brush. You see how I changed the position of my brush? Then I'm going to move over here and just drag my brush along. Maybe I'm going to use the flat of my brush, get lots of color in there. Again, working in, using the edge, pulling it down. I'm working my way down to the stem, like that, okay? So kind of picture yourself working to the stem. And every time you come across a yellow little area, be careful because you don't want to overwhelm it. You don't want it to disappear. Now this is a pretty big area, so if if your paper starts to get a little bit dry, don't be afraid to dip your brush in your water and re-wet an area, okay? So there. Now there, while it's still wet, I'm going to pick up just a little bit of the red, and I know this area is pretty intense, so I'm pretty brave, and I will add my red right in there because I'm not afraid that it's going to wreck anything because it's so red there. So I'm just dropping in my color, and what I mean by that is I'm touching the paper with my wet brush on the wet paper. This is called wet and wet, and I'm just working it along. Now I'm starting to actually put the strokes in the way the leaf has it going to the center line there, and that's actually going to help the look of it. Okay, makes it look more realistic, more real. There we go. I take it up to the edge, I pull it in. It's starting to spread on its own, which is lovely. And again, I'm not afraid to get in here. If it's dried on me, I'd add a touch of water to my brush before I get into it, okay? So I'm pretty happy with that layer. It doesn't look identical, and I know I can darken it quite a bit more, but I feel pretty good about where we're headed with this. I'm going to add just a touch more of the dark red and let it flow in over here. Nice. In the meantime, this one has almost dried up. I'm going to give it a few more minutes, and same with this one. And I love how it's blending. So I'm going to hold it up very gently. Now, don't ever pick up your painting at this point. Leave it flat. Never pick it up to show it to anyone or anything like that. So I'm using the entire board. If I have to move it around, I'm moving it around on my board. Okay, but I wanted you to be able to see the flow of colors. Now, before this flow of colors finishes, I'm going to drop in a couple of those green spots. So I'm going to just clean out my brush again. I've been only using one brush. I'm quite content to do so. I love small flat brushes. You can use just the corners. You can get small areas, you can get large areas. So now if I put in this green, it might flood all over the place. So I'm going to work an area where there's a lot more green than there is any of the reds. You may wonder, well, what does it matter? Wouldn't it look cool if it just spreads all over the place? But what happens when you mix red and green together? What color do you get? And do I want that color? So think about that. What colors do you get if you mix red and green together? And the answer is brown. So I have to be careful that where I'm placing the color is where I really want green, and then that I don't mind if some of that area turns a little bit of brown, which is the natural thing that a leaf does. So I'm okay with that. But you can see I'm only putting a tiny little amount in there. I haven't put in a bunch of color. So I'm doing a little bit over here too, because I want it to look natural, and a touch up at the top. And I'm trying to make it look like little speckles. So I'm doing that on purpose. In another painting I might not, but for this particular painting I want to. So I'm picking up a tiny bit of green now. I'm going to go into this area where the red is, and I'm going to drop in a touch of color. A touch of green to give the idea of a brown. I want it to mix on its own. I want these kind of broken, I don't know if you can see it, sorry, these kind of rough areas here, and I want it to be done naturally, and that's what happens if you drop a complementary color. So red and green are opposite each other on the color wheel, They are complementary colors, and you're going to get that nice dark brown that I'm looking for. Add a touch up there. And I'm going to